Hey everyone, welcome to Redefining Work podcast. I'm your host, Lars Schmidt, and today I'm really excited to be sitting down with Carmen Whitney Orr. Carmen is the Chief People Officer at Yelp. She has a great background across a range of leadership roles in HR that we're going to explore, as well as getting into some of the findings of Yelp's recent remote work report, which is a fascinating look at Yelp and search data and how that actually helped them get a gauge of population density and movement across the US. So, Carmen, welcome to the show. Thanks for coming on. I'd love to have you open with an introduction for the audience.
Hey, Lars, thank you so much. It's really great to be here. Like you said, I am currently the Chief People Officer at Yelp, and I'm a longtime HR practitioner. So my career in HR spans a couple of decades. I hate to date myself, but I would say it has really unfolded in a couple of different chapters. I spent 10 years working at the Home Depot, where I really cut my teeth in the HR space and had an opportunity to really learn the ins and outs of HR, and had the opportunity to do both line roles and customer-facing roles, and really learned a great deal. And then the second chapter was really working at eBay and transitioning into the technology space, where similarly continued to hone my skills in HR and get exposure to leading multiple facets of HR in the organization. And I have now been at Yelp for just over a year in my first role as Chief People Officer, and have just been really having a fantastic time working at the company and advancing our remote work strategy.
Yeah, well, I have a lot of questions about your role at Yelp and the remote work strategy in particular. But before we get into your current role, as you mentioned, prior to joining Yelp, you'd had two, long runs at both Home Depot and eBay. And what I found really interesting about those roles is they seemed to be such developmental roles for you, having the opportunity to have, over a half dozen, I think, different roles in your time at each of the companies. And I'm curious to get your perspective, like how, being in that environment, really kind of back-to-back environments where you are able to stretch and grow in different ways. How did that shape kind of your views towards the work, and how did that maybe help you, hone in on an aspiration for moving into the Chief People Officer role?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think I've been really fortunate in my career to have had the opportunity to work for a few really great companies, and also large companies that gave me an opportunity to move pretty frequently and explore different facets of the HR and all of the facets of the HR role. So really developing first in the talent management space, which was my first love in HR. And then as I thought about my career progression in HR, I remember thinking, the HR business partner role seems like a really critical and core capability to master. So let me try and do this. I'll spend a couple of years, and that'll make me a better practitioner in the talent management space. And then fast forward 10 years later, I was still working in that space, but had really the opportunity to first in a retail environment, like very large retail environment, work in both corporate functional roles as well as field-facing roles, which really taught me different aspects of, it means something to be strategic when you're operating at scale, and something entirely different to be strategic when you're kind of operating in a more nuanced G&A environment. So those were really great opportunities. And then thinking about how to transition what I learned at Home Depot, in a very large and established company, to the technology space was really fascinating. Really different environment, but similarly had opportunities to start off at eBay as an HR business partner, and then was approached to take on a shared services role. And I remember having a conversation with my leader at the time where I said, yeah, I have zero experience. I have lots of experience as a business partner for operational roles and supporting operational leaders, but no experience running an operation of my own. Sounds great. Sign me up. So like really taking the opportunity to apply transferable skills and broaden my knowledge of the HR space, I think has really served me very well in my career. And at eBay, I was fortunate to have the opportunity to lead most facets at some portion of my career of HR, which then definitely led me to the path of chief people officer. And there were some, certainly some serendipity in that career journey, as well as willingness to raise my hand and make some maybe less obvious moves. And then just some choices that were very deliberate and like, these are the capabilities I need to round out in order to ultimately take the top job, which I've been very fortunate to be able to do now at Yelp.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, when you look at when you look at the path to a CPO role today, it's really varied, and there's some scenarios where it's people that have, worked through the different functions within HR, and ultimately that, gain the skills and experience through that prepare them for the role. We're seeing more scenarios where people may even be moving into that role from other areas of the business, or their career path is definitely not solely kind of linear now. And it's interesting for practitioners, maybe who are Whitney from Carmen from 10 years ago, right? They're in a role, they're in an organization, they're trying to think about their own growth, and maybe they are in a large organization where they have that opportunity to have stretch assignments, have nonlinear assignments. And they do aspire to head down the CPO path at one point. What advice do you have for them? How should they be thinking about kind of developing, and or diversifying their career now if that CPO seat is kind of in their aspirations?
I would say definitely raise your hand for opportunities, even if you haven't had that direct experience. That's the only way you get it. Is to step into either a project assignment or a new role. And then also kind of think about like, what are the broader set of capabilities? Like if you aspire to be a chief people officer, what are the broader set of capabilities and experiences that you need? And think about ways that you might gain some exposure to those experiences. So again, I think some of the most rewarding experiences I've had in my career have been coaching and working with some of my team members to encourage them to take a role that may be less obvious to them, where they have come back and said, yeah, but I've never done that. And it's like, no, I know. And that's the reason
That's the point.
to take the role and then to watch them thrive in those roles. Because if you like, even if I look back at the very beginning of my career, I really thought, talent management and leadership development, that's the path for me. And I still love that I get the opportunity to still play in that space. I became much better in that capacity, having taken on other roles, having served as a business partner. And I think vice versa. So if you're in a COE role and you want to get a line facing role, I mean, that just gives you the different perspective. So I would just say the broader base of opportunity and exposure that you can get, because the field of HR is so vast and so broad, the better prepared that you'll be to take on increasing levels of leadership in HR.
Yeah. And you've been, in your first CPO role for actually a year now, right? You joined in February of 22. Is that right?
I joined in January of 22. And
okay.
So I just celebrated what we call our Yelp anniversary. So I have my 1 year Yelp anniversary. So I'm very excited.
I'm curious, you obviously knowing that this was a career aspiration of yours to kind of move into a role like this, and you were very deliberate about kind of diversifying the different, roles and teams and experiences you were able to build that prepared you to move in a role like this. Having been now in the role for a year, looking back, is there anything that maybe you anticipated you would or wouldn't need that was a surprise for you once you were in that seat today?
It wasn't as much of a surprise, but one of the areas that I had less direct exposure to was the leading the total rewards space, and then having interaction with the board. So like that's been a great learning experience for me over the last year. Something that you would always anticipate, of course, as very important for a chief people officer. So if I had gone back, I might have tried to get a little bit more exposure to those things. But I guess the thing I would just say is, there's no such thing as 100% preparation. And
Yeah.
if you wait to be 100% prepared, you're going to sit around and be waiting. And so I think what I've relied on is my ability to learn and be agile and utilize my resources. And so I would just say to folks, like, you're never going to know everything that you need to know, and just need to know how to learn and how to get the answers to the things that
Yeah.
are going to be important.
I'm really glad you mentioned that, kind of knowing how to learn, because I think, learning agility is probably one of the most important traits of not just CPOs, but, people practitioners and certainly leaders in these dynamic times. And again, the field of HR and people operations, however you want to frame it, has never been more complex. It's never been more nuanced. It's never been more critical to both the business and the employees. And so there's no way that anybody's going to walk in knowing everything. And the core kind of leverage drivers also shifts, right? Like total rewards now, hugely important as we talk about, we're talking differently about things like pay equity, and obviously, retention in an environment with economic uncertainty, and how we address that, not coming long off of, the period known as the Great Resignation, when, comp packages ballooned. And it's such an interesting time. And I'm curious, with you joining, Yelp a little over a year ago, what drew you to the company? I imagine with your experience, you had a range of opportunities to explore. What was it about Yelp that compelled you to come on board?
Hmm. Yeah, I was at a point where I was starting to listen to, there were a lot of opportunities out there at the time, as you said, and a number of things were coming across my desk, and they were interesting, but nothing quite really sparked my interest. Like here, I didn't kind of wasn't super excited until I got the Yelp opportunity. And first and foremost, I have been a longtime user of the product. So I have moved around a lot in my career, and I've traveled a lot. And so I've always utilized Yelp as that trusted platform to let me know what's going on wherever I am. So I knew the product, loved the product, and so that intrigued me. And then when I'm looking at companies, I really always look at it from a lens of the culture, the people, and the purpose. And as I dug in and had conversations with the Yelp leadership team, it really just ticked off all three of those boxes for me. I mean, Yelp has a very special culture that's really focused on inclusion and belonging, and like some longstanding core values. Founder-led company, very much employee focused and focused on the communities that we serve. And the mission of the company is strong. We connect people with great local businesses, and specifically at a time coming out of the pandemic, supporting our local businesses, like to me, is more important than ever. And then just the people that I talked to over the course of my interviews just really solidified that all of that. I want to work with smart people who like really get energized about doing meaningful stuff, and and living into the values that Yelp espoused. And that just really was very evident in every conversation that I had. So it was, it was just like never in doubt for me, like from conversation one, that like this was a special place and something that I wanted to be a part of.
Yeah. I mean, it's always interesting when when you're a customer, right? When you're a user of a product, and you have this view of the company based on your experience as a customer or as a user. And so when you can kind of get into the company, and obviously in your role into the company deeply, and really see the values come to life and how you connect with the leadership team. And I'm sure just reinforces the, imagine affinity you already had going in as a user. That's always an interesting, place to be that I think makes for some really powerful connections and matches. You joined soon after you joined. Yelp announced that they were moving to remote first, and that other companies have been through that journey. Other companies are still going through that journey. Other companies are reversing steps that they made towards that journey. I think, the conversation around remote and hybrid is so nuanced and individual to every specific company. What was that experience like for you, particularly coming in as a new leader? So you didn't necessarily have the historical perspective of how things were, but now you are the architect of how things are going to be. What was that process like for you, and kind of how did you land on how you think about the structure of remote work at Yelp?
Yeah, it's actually one of the things that drew me to Yelp as well. The company at the time I was interviewing was already in a remote first posture.
Hmm.
And shortly after I joined, we announced like we are leaning in and going fully remote. So Yelp never announced a return to office date. And I had experienced that in previous careers, and that's just painful experience. We're coming back in the summer. Oh no, we're going to come back in the fall. And, the pandemic had other plans. And I think, to the leadership team and to the leadership team's credit, they kind of looked at what was happening and listened to the sentiment of the employees and understood the business results to say, oh, wow. I mean, this wasn't something we would have envisioned, of course, but we, are questioning these long held paradigms about, work having to take place within these four walls with everybody together. And this is actually something that really seems to be working at Yelp. And so the company and the leadership team had decided early on to kind of really lean into being remote first. And then as we continued to listen to our employees, and that's one of the things that I think Yelp does really well, is really gauge employee sentiment and act on it. Our employees overwhelmingly, 87% of them were telling us that the remote first model was making them more effective, that they wanted to work remotely most of the time, that both leaders and employees felt that they could meet their goals in a remote environment. Over 90% of them self-reported that. And we were seeing that borne out in the business results. So Yelp's had, despite some economic headwinds, we had a record-setting revenue year in 2022. And just really solid performance coming out of the pandemic. So it was something that we said, wow, it's working. And we did move to open some of our offices for employees to come in if they wanted to. And they voted with their feet. So on any given day, we had less than 2% of our employees on a global basis actually attending a Yelp office. And, frankly, that just doesn't seem like a great use of resources. So taking employee sentiment with business results, it just seemed really prudent that, hey, this is something that's really working for us. And let's continue to lean in here and differentiate.
Yeah, I mean, and you also, earlier this year, and correct me on the date, but recently you had released the remote work report, which was a fascinating look at talent mobility trends based on the data, the immense data you have at Yelp of users. And it was interesting. You shared some feedback as well around the impact on your kind of recruiting and hiring efforts within Yelp. And one of the things I was curious to get your perspective on, as you solidified, I would say, being remote first, and obviously you're now recruiting from a range of different talent pools. Did you see any correlation between, or impact of that, I should say, the ability to now recruit on a nationwide basis and your ability to tap into more diverse pools of talent for the business? Did you see any kind of correlation between any diversity numbers adjusting based on this new kind of hiring model across the entire U.S.?
Yeah. So actually, we've had from a geographic footprint standpoint, like this has had a dramatic effect on our footprint. So not only have we diversified our footprint in the U.S., prior to the pandemic, 97% of our employees were located within the U.S. We've now expanded to almost 20% of our employees being based outside of the U.S.
Oh, wow.
So we're really recruiting talent on a global scale and opening the aperture to talent in locations that we just didn't have access to it before. So clearly that gives us more access to diverse talent pools, like wherever they reside. And then we've also seen, just like as an aside, like for our existing employees, our employees choose to relocate to places that are better suited to them, either for cost of living reasons or to be near family or just to be somewhere else that they're located. So we've seen a 50% increase in the unique cities where our current employees are living. So certainly a huge geographic spread. And then from an actual talent attraction standpoint, we've seen some really significant, like even against a backdrop of a very competitive labor market, we've seen an increase of almost 200% in the applicants for our general administrative positions, 25% in our sales positions, and then our talent, our sourcing pools for our tech talent become much more efficient, and resulting overall for the company in a reduction in time to fill by 6 days or almost 25%. So significant there. From a diversity standpoint, we're proud of the results that we're starting to see, and then we have more room to grow. We have seen over that period of time about a 4% increase in employees who identify as Black. Our manager level positions, we've seen an increase in underrepresented minorities from like 10% to 18%, and over 46% of our managers identify as female. So we still have room to grow, and there's more effort that we are planning to make in this space, but starting to see some fruits of our ability to recruit diverse talent regardless of location.
Yeah. Yeah, and I appreciate you sharing that. And I'll include a link to the report in the show notes for the podcast. So if you're watching or listening, I definitely encourage you to check that out. There's some fascinating information, and just look at the lens of data or talent migration through data in a very unique way that I just appreciated. So I think that'll give you something to nerd out on and dig into. One thing I'd love to get your perspective on as well, based on an event, last year, you mentioned one of the things that really drew you to Yelp as you got in is really just the strong core values that they had that had been there from the inception. And I'm imagining a place and a time that showed up last year was, last year when reproductive rights were stripped away in the United States. Yelp had a feature that they announced where you could actually learn more about local businesses, plans and approaches directly through the app. And I'd love to hear more about the functionality, but I'd also love to hear just a behind the scenes look at how something like that came to be, because it generated fairly quickly after the news. This was a very fast moving, fast developing story. And I think it was an area that I remember even at the time when I saw that, I was just impressed at how quickly Yelp acted on that. So I'd love to just get an inside look at how that came to be and kind of some of the conversations behind that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, as I mentioned, one of the things that I'm really proud of the company for is our willingness to both listen to our employees and what's important to them, and also to take a stand that may not be popular, instead of waiting to see what the prevailing wisdom is. So I think we've been very outspoken on the issue of reproductive rights. Our founder, Jeremy Stoppelman, I think just fundamentally believes that this was against our core values. It was something that was important to our employees. And we were hearing from our employees that this is important. It's a fundamental human right. that we're all concerned with. So I think two things coming out of that time period is I think we were very early on to announce a travel benefit for employees who are in impacted states if they didn't have access to reproductive health care to be able to travel outside of their state if they were covered by one of Yelp's benefit plans for them and their dependents. So that was one thing. And then we also, from a product standpoint, implemented a consumer notice on any Yelp business pages that were categorized as crisis pregnancy centers. And that was to inform consumers that these businesses may provide limited medical services or may not have licensed medical providers on site. And that's, again, from a product standpoint, trust and safety is really fundamental to Yelp's business model and to our success. So we really want to ensure that our consumers aren't misled into thinking that our business provides services, especially for something as sensitive as abortion care. So I think just for us, like the organization is really strongly guided by like what's the right thing to do in these circumstances, and kind of not afraid to take a stand on some of these important social justice issues.
Yeah. I mean, I think that the topic of, some of these social justice issues and just, we're in this time right now where there's a range of social justice issues. There's geopolitical conflict. There's political turmoil. It's not an easy time to be leading people teams and kind of being the voice sometimes of an organization as the company navigates all of these external factors. How do you, obviously being such a values-led organization, and that certainly steering the way that you approached the scenario of the erasure of reproductive rights, how do you as a leader kind of think about how to navigate and or respond to or not to respond to the range of things that tend to be coming up these days? Because that seems to be something that I think a lot of people leaders struggle with. And I'm just curious to get your perspective. I think especially for earlier career, leaders in that first time head of people role, maybe you haven't experienced and you haven't lived through and you haven't worked through or navigated some of these different types of flashpoints. Did you have any advice for how you personally kind of think about navigating those at Yelp?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. Unfortunately these days there isn't a lack of things happening in our external environment to respond to. So you can't respond to absolutely everything, right? So for us, I think one, Jeremy Stoppelman, our founder, is like very involved in these types of issues and direct communication with our employees when some of these things happen. So there's a regular channel that's directly from Jeremy to our employees. We also kind of look at it from, where does this trip up against Yelp's values? And, how might it impact the communities also that we serve from a business perspective? So, I mean, it's hard to say that like, there's a specific rubric. I wish there were, that would make it a lot easier. But it's, I think there's some discernment there along with letting the values and the impact on our business and our customers be our guide.
Yeah, no, I appreciate your perspective on that. And, you're right. Yeah, there has been no shortage of external events to navigate and guide through. But again, I think working with a very values led organization is a great way to kind of have that be the litmus test for how you respond and how you guide not just the business, but both, there's a range of stakeholders, right? It's the executive team, it's the business itself, it's the employees, it's the customers and external community. So, all of those things I think have to factor into the calculus of how you respond.
And I think we also try to ensure that we provide flexibility, right? Because not everyone, different things matter more to different people. So we do have a foundation, employees can contribute. We do matching gifts. So that's a way for our employees to also give to causes or events that matter to them.
Yeah. Well, Carmen, I really appreciate you coming on the podcast, sharing your role, your work, your background, and a lot of wisdom for the audience. We close every episode with a lightning round just to help the audience get to know you a little bit better, and we always start with music. So I'm gonna hit you up now for your first concert. What was your first concert that you recall?
It would have been White Snake and Great White. So I still to this day will share that one of my really weird superpowers is a freakish knowledge of 80s hair bands. So if you're ever like playing bar trivia and 80s hair bands are a topic, then I'm your phone a friend.
I appreciate knowing that now. I feel like I have solid knowledge, but I wouldn't. I think you just put your bona fides up there, and now I feel like I'm not at your level. So I will. I'll definitely hit you up on that. Next question I have for you is, what is bringing you joy lately?
Mm. So I recently moved to downtown Austin. So I've been having a great time exploring the city, uh, checking out all the new restaurants here, and Yelp has been a great guide in that perspective. So that's one thing, and then another thing that's bringing me a lot of joy over the last year and a half, I'd say, is I've really gotten into yoga, which is something I never thought I would say. But I've been really enjoying deepening my yoga practice and getting a little more zen.
Yeah. Well, Zen, there's lots of Zen in Austin, and there's lots of hair bands in Austin too. So I think
That's
live
true.
music, you were in a great spot for live music. Last question for you. Obviously, you're a little over a year now into your first chief people officer. For those who are aspiring to be in that role, what's one piece of advice you have for them?
I think kind of harkening back to our earlier conversation, uh, raise your hand, take the non-obvious moves, get as much exposure to different facets of HR and people operations as possible,
Yeah.
and don't be afraid. Don't let what you've done in the past guide you to what you try to do in the future.
Yeah. Well, that's great advice. If you're watching or listening, take that to heart. And Carmen, thanks so much for coming on the show, sharing your career, your wisdom, and your journey, and your tips on 80s hair bands. So now now I know I have a phone a friend for that, and now I'm gonna call you on that.
Awesome. All right. Well, it's been a blast. Thanks, Lars.